The story we're about to look at today is like an antidote to any kind of prosperity or success religion. It is one of those narratives of the Old Testament which more than any maybe highlight the gospel of also the Christian message. Welcome to yet another tidbit from the book of Daniel. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen. We have arrived in chapter 3. The three friends of Daniel are thrown into the fiery furnace because they refuse to bow down and worship an image. An event and a story which is reflected in the end-time prophecies of Revelation 13, where people will be asked to, commanded to worship an image once again. We will keep to Daniel 3, and let us first look at the story in itself. That is the structure of the narrative of Daniel 3, without looking at how it connects to what we have previously in the book and what follows. The story is, also this story I should add, very nicely structured and put together. It opens with Nebuchadnezzar's actions. He builds a statue, and then he summons all the officials of Babylon in order to worship the statue, the image he has created. Now, if you look at the end, you will see in the end of the chapter, in verse 30, you will see the result of that action regarding the friends of Daniel who are promoted in the province of Babylon. And you will find that this story is like a reversed mirror story, like a chiasm from the Greek letter chi. When you go from the beginning, you then have Nebuchadnezzar who speaks to what he calls all peoples, nations, and languages with a threat of the fire furnace unless they worship an idol. In the end, Nebuchadnezzar also issues a decree to people, nations, and tongues, where he speaks about the young men who have been saved from this fire because they did not worship the idol. Moving further in, you have Chaldeans who accuse the Jews regarding their lack of worship, and you have on the other side Nebuchadnezzar addressing his advisors regarding the three men in the fire furnace. Further into the middle, you have in verse 13 to 15 the anger, the wrath of the king Nebuchadnezzar. That wrath, the Aramaic word chema, is used again in verse 19, where he is reacting to the sender in the middle, to the speech or the answer by the three friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That is the answer we find in verses 16 to 18. This is the very center of the story from a literary angle. It is also where you have the theology of the chapter most clearly articulated, and we'll return to that. But let's look at the narrative from the beginning as it flows. King Nebuchadnezzar, the mighty king of Babylon, he builds a statue. As we read, and I will read from the New International Version, you will notice the emphasis on what Nebuchadnezzar is doing. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 19 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Notice this term, to set it up. This is from the Aramaic kum, the same you have in the famous phrase spoken by Jesus to the little girl he healed, Talita kum. This word becomes a key word here in the story as we read on. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. He had set up. Now, the word is used in Daniel 9. It is used in the prayer by Daniel about the God who, according to verse 21, is the one who sets up kings and deposes them. So here you have the king who has had a dream with a statue where gold was replaced by silver, indicating that his kingdom was replaced by another. And now he sets up a statue that is completely covered by gold. He sets it up. He is the one who sets it up. He is the one who wants to show, I am in power. And there is, of course, as we know the story, a certain irony. So it says, notice once again the repetitions. The satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. It becomes a little ridiculous to repeat them all the time, and this is the very point of the way it is told. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language." As soon as you hear the sound of, and then you have another list, a long list now of musical instruments. In this translation, horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music. You must fall down and worship the image of God that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And then you have the threat. Now, just a word on some of these musical instruments. When you read different translations, you sometimes find words like bagpipe, and you think of the Scottish bagpipe. This is an anachronism. It is sometimes difficult to find the exact word for an instrument of music that we do not have any longer. It was not a Scottish sagpipe. There are also three other words that most likely have a Greek origin, which very well could be due to the fact that there are professional Greek musicians around at the various royal courts, also in this case. The last words, symphonia, sounds very much like our symphony, and so it is, something sounding together. And one suggestion is that this is the signal. Every instrument was played, each at its time, and then in the end they all sounded together, and that was the sign for the people there to bow down. Now it happened that the three friends of Daniel were there as well, and some of their enemies, they noticed they did not bow down. So they come to the king and they tell the story, you know what happens, and the king summons them. He's angry, but he gives them a chance, and he challenges them. In verses 13 and onwards, "Is it true," he says in verse 14, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, or worship the image of God I have set up?" Now when you hear, then you have the list of musical instruments, and you fall down and worship, that's very good. Then he will forget about the first incident. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? This is a challenge. And we come to the answer. But let's first note, Nebuchadnezzar is doing something that even against the background of his own culture is unusual. It was not usual to have such kind of public worship of the images where everyone was outside. No, the image would be taken into the temple and worshipped there. Next, you cannot force worship. Oh, yes, they all bowed down. What kind of worship is that? When you know that if you don't, you lose your life. The three friends of Daniel reply to the king, and their answer has been translated in different ways. So let's just reflect on it for a moment. Do they say that there is no God who can do it? Now today you meet people who would say, there is no God. That is hardly their attitude. That would have been against the cultural background, against the culture of the time. No, this is not their message. What do they say? Do they express a doubt in the power of God, saying, if he is able? And that is not the message either. Scholars have pondered upon the grammar, and here is the translation that I have found to be the most reliable. This is the way they put it. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter if the God whom we serve is able to save us. And from the fiery furnace and from your hand or your power, O king, he will save. They trust he is able, they trust he is there, but then they say, but even if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your God, and we will not worship the golden statue you have set up. He's able. But even if he doesn't do it, doesn't change our view. Our obedience to God is not dependent on the outcome. We do not only worship him when it pays off. It's not a matter of success or prosperity. We serve a God who has the power, who may choose to use it, but who is worthy to be obeyed and worshipped independently of the result. Their relationship is not the relationship of someone trading with God. It is relationship of trust. They obey him because they trust him. They follow and worship because they love him. So here's the irony. God saved them. They were successful in this particular situation exactly because they refused to be disloyal, even if they had not been. So it is not the success that matters. It's a commitment independently of the outcome. This is part of the gospel message. As you look at the end result of the event, there are some questions. Notice, Nebuchadnezzar makes an attempt to force the presence of God. He builds a statue. This is like an idol, a god. God is now present here among you by way of the statue I have set up. But Nebuchadnezzar, who tries to force God's presence, has no contact with God. And when finally God appears, he is scared. The three friends, however, who make no demands, who obey God and worship God independently of the outcome, they experience his presence in the midst of the fire. In the end, then, Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree. This is what he says in verse 26, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent this his angel," that is his messenger, the divine presence in the fire furnace. "He has rescued his servants. Therefore I decree," he says in 29, "that the people of any nation or language who say anything against God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." And then they were promoted. Now some scholars read this as if Nebuchadnezzar has now begun to worship God. No. His decree is a decree that prohibits anyone in accusing the God of the Jews, just like the Chaldeans had done. He is not yet worshipping or submitting to God. So there are nuances in his reaction, in his response, and we have to move into the next chapter, chapter 4, until we see him really commissioned or submitted and committed to God. But that's for another tidbit. Thank you for listening to this tidbit from Daniel 3, and welcome back to our tidbit from Daniel chapter 4.